Good evening and welcome to the Fall 2020 Colvin Lecture. On behalf of the faculty, students, staff, and alumni of the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, as well as our esteemed panelists, we thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm Don Linebaugh, Interim Dean of the school, and it's my great pleasure to help kick off the lecture tonight, titled Gentrification, Deracination of the Black Community in Harlem and Washington, D.C. I want to thank our panelists for being with us tonight, and I know we all look forward to their presentations. The last year has been an exciting but challenging one for the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, as the nation has faced the double pandemics of the coronavirus and the deaths of members of the Black community at the hands of police. We're working hard to address these challenges. Over the past year, our students, alumni, and faculty have won many awards, competitions, and prizes, and been recognized for their research and practice expertise. The school received approval for and launched several new degree programs, including an undergraduate major in real estate development that will bring our quadruple bottom line philosophy to an entirely new cohort of students. When the coronavirus pandemic hit, the school quickly pivoted from offering most of our classes in person to delivering them online in order to protect the health and safety of our community members. Simultaneously, our faculty, staff, and students rallied to develop a school-wide anti-racism plan and have quickly been implementing its recommendations. We are so proud of the school's accomplishments during this difficult time, a true reflection of our innovative and creative spirit. Our students come from all over the US and around the world, bringing with them a wide range of interests and experiences. That diversity is reflected in the quality of the students and the programs at Maryland, and our creative spirit is clearly evident in the Colvin Institute. The Institute was founded by Baltimore-based developer John Colvin and his wife Karen Colvin to support research, industry outreach, and student enhancements for the Master of Real Estate Development program at Maryland. John believed that the Colvin Institute stood on the cutting edge of real estate education and that the region is an unparalleled laboratory for the study of real estate development. He felt that virtually every type of development opportunity existed in our area. His pride in the University of Maryland was personal and profound, as he said at the time that the Institute was established. It was a privilege for him to give back to his alma mater and to his chosen profession. The Colvin Institute is just one of many activities and events. The Colvin Lecture is just one of the many activities and events that the Institute hosts each year, and we hope you'll come and join us for some of those other events. None of this would be possible without the generosity and dedication of John and Karen Colvin. It's now my great pleasure to introduce my wonderful colleague, Maria Day Marshall, the director of the Real Estate Development Program here at Maryland, and also director of the Colvin Institute. And she will introduce our panelists tonight. Maria.
Thank you, Dean Linebaugh, for the introduction and for your support of the Colvin Institute of Real Estate Development. Welcome to the Colvin Institute of Real Estate Development 2020 Fall Lecture. This year, we are featuring gentrification, deracination of the Black community in Harlem and Washington, D.C. We have a group of esteemed panelists today who are going to discuss a topic that we believe is timely given the societal issues that are occurring in our country and around the world currently. However, before I introduce them, I would like to recognize a handful of special people that support the Colvin Institute and the Real Estate Development Program every day, including Carrie Chard, Assistant Director, the Colvin Institute, Tanya Bonsall, Assistant Director and Assistant Professor of the Real Estate Development Program, Laura Steeg, Program Assistant, and we have 3 great graduate assistants who help us every day, Wishi Zhang, Mohsen Tiamori, and Hussam Mansour. I would now like to introduce our panelists. In the interest of time, I will let them talk about their research interests and other accomplishments. First, we have Dr. Kevin Mc Gruder, who is Vice President of Academic Affairs and Professor of History at Antioch College. Next, we have Dr. Hyra, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Public Administration and Policy at American University. Next, we have Dr. Sabia Prince, who is an independent researcher. And finally, the panel discussion will be moderated by our own Dr. Willow Lung-Amam, Associate Professor in the Urban Studies and Planning Program at the University of Maryland. I want to thank them all for sharing their views with us today. If you have questions for the panelists, please click the Q&A button rather than the chat box. I know that you're anxious to hear from them, so without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Lung-Amam. Willow?
Thank you so much, Maria. It is really an honor to be able to stand here in my office, but also in this space with some of the colleagues and honestly friends whose work that I deeply respect. This is really an esteemed panel of folks who have done some of the deepest and most cutting edge work I know here in the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm so excited to be able to learn more and hear more about Harlem. So without further ado, I want to allow us to dig a little bit deeper into our panelists' research and to understand a little bit more about how they got here. So I'm curious to hear from each of you about what is your intersection of research with the topic that we're here to discuss today, but also what is your personal, a piece perhaps of your personal journey that attaches you to the place and the topic that we're talking about. So Kevin, I'll start with you.
I began, well, in terms of my research, my book, Race and Real Estate, Conflict and Cooperation in Harlem, 1890 to 1920, looks at another period of major change in Harlem when it was shifting from a predominantly white community to what would become known as the Black capital of the world. And I'm about to have published next year a follow-up book, Philip Payton, the father of Black Harlem. Payton started the Afro-American Realty Company in Harlem in 1904 and is really credited with kind of orchestrating the momentum, the increased momentum of Black people to Harlem. Personally, I come to those topics really from four perspectives. As a Harlem resident, I moved to New York in 1982 and got my MBA in real estate finance from Columbia. And as soon as I got to New York, literally the first week I was there, I went to a lecture on the Harlem Renaissance and just started going to Harlem, got very interested in it. And after I graduated, I was working in the nonprofit community development field, but continued to be involved with Harlem through my church, Abyssinian Baptist Church. And so I moved to Harlem in 1985 and lived there until 2012. And so the period that we're focusing on tonight, I lived through that and have perspectives in that way. Another is as an entrepreneur, because of my love of Harlem, I had two Harlem specialty shops. One called Home to Harlem that was on 125th and 5th Avenue from 1990 to 1991. And then from 2000 to 2008, I was co-owner of another store, Harlem Made Style Shop on Lenox Avenue between 118th and 119th Street. And so I really, from a businessman's point of view, I bring that perspective as well. And then as a real estate practitioner, in the 90s, I became director of real estate development at the Abyssinian Development Corporation. Abyssinian Baptist Church was founded in 1808, moves to Harlem in 1923. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. orchestrated that move. His son, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., kind of put the church on the map in terms of the world, particularly when he became a congressman. And the Development Corporation was started in the mid 80s, and I was part of a group of founders of that, volunteer members of the church. And in 1991, after I closed that Home to Harlem store, I became director of real estate development. And that was exactly at the time that there were some key things happening. When I moved to Harlem in 1985, the city owned 60% of the property in Harlem. New York has a law that allows them to take ownership of buildings if they are behind in real estate taxes and utility bills after multiple years, so it doesn't happen right away. But that abandonment of the 1970s with the oil price increase led to abandonment in the Bronx, in Harlem, and Brooklyn, and the city owned a lot of property. And in the 90s, they started looking at ways to get that property off of their books. And nonprofits were, in large part, the recipients of that. And they created programs, particularly once the low-income housing tax credit came into existence with the change in the tax laws in 1986. And so the Development Corporation built, renovated in the 90s, probably about 300 units of housing, primarily in multifamily buildings. And so I was a part of that. And then as a scholar, I taught as an adjunct at Baruch College in the 90s and started thinking about my interest in history and decided to go back and get a doctorate from City University of New York. And so I got that doctorate in 2010. And when I was thinking about a dissertation topic, I knew it was going to be about Harlem. And so the book, Race and Real Estate, is really an expansion of my dissertation from that time. And so those are the perspectives that I bring to the conversation about what has happened in Harlem and kind of what's happening now.
Thank you, Kevin. Derek, I'm going to turn to you. I think you provide a nice bridge between Harlem and Washington, D.C., given that you've studied both.
Thanks, Willow. First, I want to thank the Colvin Institute for the invitation to come be a part of this panel. I've learned a lot just hearing Kevin's introduction and deeply appreciate being part of the wealth of knowledge to talk about race and real estate in two of the most historic African-American communities in the country, Harlem, and I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about Shaw U Street in Washington, D.C. So a little bit about my background or some of my research. My dissertation was called The New Urban Renewal, and it looked at the redevelopment that was happening in the mid to late 90s in Harlem and comparing to what was happening on the south side of Chicago in Bronzeville. So I lived in Bronzeville. I also flew to New York and lived in New York City while doing this work, and talked to a lot of people at the Abyssinian Baptist Church that Kevin mentioned. But I also wrote another book called Race, Class, and Politics in the Cappuccino City. And this is all about Washington, D.C., and how Washington has dramatically changed economically, socially, politically in the 90s and 2000s and beyond. So I know we're going to be talking a lot about real estate and development in New York and in Washington. And I've studied both areas. And on a personal note, I mean, a lot of people ask me, how did I get involved and interested in studying Harlem, Bronzeville, Shaw? And, you know, Kevin again talked about Abyssinian Baptist Church. Well, my affiliation with Harlem and its West Harlem is with Riverside Church. I grew up north of New York City, about an hour, in a completely segregated white suburb. But in high school, for 2 years, I played AAU basketball for Riverside Church. So I drove down the Sawmill Parkway, got to Riverside and played basketball on 135th Street, on 155th Street in the Rucker League. And I developed a lot of relationships with my teammates, and all of them are from Harlem or from the Bronx. And those 2 years, and this is Harlem, not gentrified Harlem, this is Harlem coming off the crack epidemic. This is the in-rem housing stock, again, that Kevin mentioned, that is just sitting there. And that environment is affecting my teammates. And I saw it firsthand. And my research is all about how do we get investments into underserved areas, but do it in a way where we minimize displacement and maximize the benefits for long-term low-income residents, basically my teammates. So for me, this research is really personal, but I do try to keep a professor academic objective lens. But when I'm doing this research, I'm doing it based on my experiences in Harlem as somebody growing up in high school. So thank you for having me be a part of this, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Derek, the one book that you did not mention in your talk is the one that you co-authored and edited with Sabia Prince. Sabia.
I figured Sabia would do that.
You're muted.
I apologize. I thought that someone muted me. I didn't realize I had muted myself. But yes, thanks to the organizers first and foremost for putting this together. And I look forward to the conversation too. Thanks to everyone. DC is a city that I was actually born and raised in. You know, I lived here up until the time that I went away to college, and I've lived in other places as well. I lived in New York City, the Bronx and Brooklyn more specifically. I've lived in Poughkeepsie, New York, and I've lived in Columbia, Maryland, but came back to DC in 2015 and began to really learn more about the city as a native. It's just a kind of an odd thing to say, but I think, you know, DC is a city that the federal lens looms very large here. You know, it's a way in which people know about us, and it's a way in which we even sometimes think about ourselves. It's a city that remained a mystery to me in many ways, and it's kind of weird to say that, but you know, we don't get any local history. At least when I was growing up, we didn't. And I think it's probably common for a lot of folks when you're going through your everyday, you're growing up, you're not really thinking about context and the history of your city. You're just doing your thing, you know, and particularly when you're coming of age. But I always felt that kind of dearth of understanding our city outside of our personal history and our family history, you know, like what's going on in DC. DC is more than Capitol Hill. It's more than what's going on the mall. And it's more than the negative stories that we get about crime and about nefariousness and uprisings, etc. It's an understudied city, and I think I was motivated to want to know more about it. And that kind of drove me into the direction of doing this kind of work. And then there's my family story. I mean, I took the opportunity of writing my second book to interview the remaining elders in my family. All of them have since passed away. The book was African Americans and Gentrification in Washington, D.C. And for that book, I had 3 research questions. I wanted to know, looking at different parts of the city, not one neighborhood, but a citywide sort of a focus, using oral histories, participant observation, secondary research to ask people, you know, how are you being affected by gentrification? How are you framing gentrification? And how are you responding to gentrification? And in addition to, you know, those questions and doing my methodology, I framed those with contextual data. You know, how do we get here? And what's the role of larger patterns of inequality for setting up communities for gentrification? You know, both sets of my grandparents migrated from the South to DC. My paternal set came here in the 40s. My maternal set came here in 1916. And both of them are connected to this history, not only of demographic change, but also specifically of gentrification. One set came to Southwest, sharing stories with me about not having running water, not having electricity. My dad told me about putting hot irons in the bed so they could be warm at night. My maternal side, my grandfather came here when he was 16, moved right to Georgetown, lived with his extended kin there before that space was gentrified. He was born in 1899. And, you know, so after he stayed there with his family, he then got married, raised his kids, went to Arthur Capo Carrollsburg, which is a public housing complex that was demolished through redevelopment schemes, you know, years back. So, you know, I didn't even realize at the time how connected my family is to this history. And it really is coming out partially, you know, from my background. I want to amplify some of these urban voices. And that's been my goal with a lot of the research that I do in DC. And then lastly, I did my doctoral dissertation research on Harlem, in Central and West Harlem, looking at the Black middle class, inquiring, is there anything uniquely middle class about this Black experience within this historic space? So those are some of the things that kind of buttress my research interests.
Great, thank you, Sabia. This is a really nice bridge between two places that I think actually are not often bridged. And I think, Sabia, you introduced the question that I was going to ask next, which is, how did we get here, and what sort of factors led us up to a point in which the Washington, D.C. area and Harlem are experiencing very intense gentrification today. But before we do that, I want to actually ask what gentrification is, because I think we're throwing out the term as if we all understand what it is. And gentrification is often a you know it when you see it kind of thing, but you all have thought very deeply about what that is. So Derek, if you can help us sort of understand and contextualize what gentrification is, but also through the lens specifically of Washington, D.C., how we got to the point, what factors played into it becoming, within recent years, one of the most intensely gentrifying area in the United States.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to define gentrification, and it's in part because so many people have different understandings of what it really means. Is it a racial transition? Is it an economic transition? Is it a political, a cultural? I think, you know, when we mention that term, all these different things get conjured up in people's heads about what they think it means, what are the causes and drivers, but also what are the implications in terms of displacement. What does it mean? What are the racial consequences? And I would say that I always start with Ruth Glass. She's the one who founded the term, right? She's a UK scholar. In 1964, she's studying London. She sees areas that are working class, that have an influx of middle and upper income people. And that changes the dynamics in the community. And it also, within her definition, gentrification leads to displacement. So displacement is directly tied to the first definition of the concept. But one of the things is that when she used it and defined it, it was a class-based concept, right? This was white, upper income whites moving into lower income white space. But when we take that process and put it onto the US context, and when we put it onto the context, particularly of Washington, DC, it becomes very racialized. We have whopping income and wealth disparities along racial lines. So when we start talking about a process of bringing in upper income people, it usually means into a low income space that has people of color. So it's very racialized within the United States. Yes, there is Black gentrification. Yes, there is multiracial gentrification, but it's very rare in our country. And when we're talking about gentrification in the US, it typically is upper income whites and white controlled money coming into a low income minority space. And the people who get displaced are typically low income African Americans and also Latinos. So I'll just sort of lay that base, but I'm sure that, you know, Sabia and Kevin probably have different ideas of what gentrification means to them. So why don't we just throw it to one of them?
I mean, linking what Derek was describing with my research, what we're talking about now is really a process in Harlem that began unfolding 100 years ago. And so the reason why Harlem becomes accessible to Black people in between 1904 and 1920 is because the real estate profession, as it becomes professionalized, the real estate brokerage profession defines Black presence in neighborhoods as unstabilizing and a vector for lowering property values. And so white people internalize that and believe that the presence of Black people in their neighborhoods will lower their values. And so in Harlem, in some cities, white people defend their neighborhoods. In Harlem, they tried to, but they weren't successful. They put in restrictive covenants, but a restrictive covenant requires unity among a group of people. Harlem, white population was very diverse, and it was new. Harlem doesn't get developed as an urban community until the 1880s and 1890s. So most of the brownstones that we see in the pictures, those were built in the 1880s, 1890s. Subway opens in 1904, the Lenox Avenue line. Those white people, some of them are new themselves. So as they try to keep Black people out, they're not unified. And each is afraid if they don't leave, their property is going to go down. So as Black people begin to come, property values do go down for a little bit, and then they go back up. But they keep going down, and there's an artificial devaluing. And there's some recent studies by the Brookings Institute and others where the link between Blackness and undervaluation has been recognized in the research. And so if you look at Harlem in the 1980s, what makes it such a great investment for white people with capital is that it's been undervalued for so long. And so if we looked at, if Harlem had been able to maintain its real estate values, there might have been some entry of Black people. If white people thought they could maintain their values, they would have stayed, but they ran because they didn't. And in their leaving, they created the psychology that, and we see this across the country, Black neighborhoods, low value, even if controlled for the property. And so that creates the conditions that when they are ready to reach across their racism, they've got undervalued property to get. And that's what happens in Harlem in the 1990s, is that racism had made Harlem into a separate market. And I definitely benefited from that. But as Harlem becomes more a place where white people feel more comfortable, they've got the capital to exploit that.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you guys are saying, and I'll just add to that I view gentrification as a part of a cycle, really. I mean, it's a cycle that rests upon disinvestment. And, it is viewed as a fix. And so the question is, fixing what? And I think, you guys have all touched upon it. It's fixing upon something that apparently there's something wrong with it. The question is, how did that happen? How did that get there? And does 1 + 3 = 2? Those are some of the questions that I think about. I mean, change is a normal part of urban life. It's a normal part of life. It's a part of culture. It's actually one of the characteristics of culture. The things that I'm concerned about when it comes to gentrification is the inequality piece. Change is going to occur. My concern, and one of the reasons why I got interested in this, is because of the unfairness, is because of the context. It's because you need to contextualize what we're looking at right now with historical data. And that's when you get into conversations about redlining, about block busting, about ghettoization, about how did we get here? We got here through policy. That's how ghettos were formed. And so, we're going to get out of it through policy as well. It's not a natural process. So my grandfather was living in Harlem, in the 1920s, and it was policies that said, hey, we need to demolish this because this doesn't look good. This is run down, so we need to tear it down. The emphasis on tearing it down, the emphasis on appearances, not an emphasis on what's the condition of the people. And maybe if we help the people, then the conditions will be improved. So, I look at gentrification as a part of this cycle of inequality, racial oppression. yes, it is a term that was originated in the UK through the, really important work of Ruth Glass. And, thank goodness now we have intersectional analysis. So, we can fold in race with class, and we can fold in gender, and we can fold in all these different variables to understand how people are affected, not only in the US and the UK, but actually all over the world. There's studies about gentrification in Shanghai and in London and in Paris and everywhere, So, that's how I view it, as a part of the cycle of disinvestment that is then throwing capital in, but we have inequality. People don't all have the same access, so people are going to get displaced, and then fold into that the part that I'm interested in, among many others, and that's the interpersonal piece. What happens on the ground when you have these sorts of dynamic things taking place? What happens with relationships across class and across race? Yeah.
Right. Well, I know you wanted to jump to the next question, but I just wanted to just put in just a couple things about, Sabia talked about this cycle of disinvestment and then reinvestment. And, many things were touched on, but I wanted to add a couple of things. Is that, one of the reasons why a place like Harlem or Shaw U Street is disinvested is access to, first we should just say it's racism, right? Racism is the clear, strong dynamic. But when we say, well, how does racism play out in the 20th century? We've got multiple mechanisms. And one of it is a lack of access to capital by people of color, right? So we have redlining. We have the Federal Housing Administration basically redlines neighborhoods. So it's very difficult, if there is an upgrading process to happen, for minorities to get a loan from a bank or a government guaranteed loan to upgrade their property. They can't get it, right? So the federal government is, has an unequal playing field for the country because of access to capital. That's one. Two, the placement of public housing. Harlem gets inundated in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s with high-rise public housing because public housing authorities place public housing, for the most part, only in Black neighborhoods, right? That's the story of Chicago. That's the story of New York City. In part, that's the story of Washington, D.C. We also have the Urban Renewal Highway, right? We've got the Highway Administration putting highways through and segregating Black neighborhoods. So we've got a lack of access to capital due to government policy. We've got the placement of public housing due to policy, and then we have the placement of housing. So these are three different ways in which there's a devaluing of Black neighborhoods. And that sets it up. Okay.
I'm sorry. I would just add that the backdrop of that is the creation of Black neighborhoods to begin with. So in 1900, those Black neighborhoods in Chicago and Harlem did not exist. Most Black people were in the South. And so we see it now and think it was foreordained that Black people would be segregated, but there were decisions made to do that. And that allowed what Derek is describing to unfold in a very efficient way. If Black people had been spread out throughout New York, it would have been much more difficult to deny them capital. But when they're all in the same place, you can deny them capital and charge them twice the rent as the white people who were there before. And so they become very profitable through their exploitation.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that too. And I want to give a quick shout out to Prologue DC, Mapping Segregation, the work of Mara and Sarah, Mara Chakowski and Sarah Schoenfeld. They show that neighborhoods in DC have become increasingly segregated following like the 1930s on, so people were actually more integrated, but then they become increasingly segregated. And of course, yes, that's a great way to, discriminate against people if they're all together. And I'm thinking about an oral history that I gathered in the community of Trinidad, where there was a beautiful elderly woman that I interviewed, and she talked about her block being the bottom half white and the top half being Black, just within one street, on one side of the street, and within 2 weeks after they moved in the 40s, the white people all begin to move out. And you have the formation of a so-called ghetto, which at this moment is now being gentrified.
Thank you all. I think that gives us a lot of context for thinking about the ways in which reinvestment in these neighborhoods, both the movement of capital into these neighborhoods and the movement of people, is driven by public policy that is rooted in historic forms of inequality, historic forms of structuring of neighborhood value along racial lines. I want to begin to dig into this a little bit, the question of what's at stake for residents in these neighborhoods a little bit more. I know, Derek, when you were talking in your initial definition of gentrification, you put displacement front and center. And that's not always front and center in the conversation about gentrification. There is some debate sometimes about whether or not gentrification can be good for established residents. And I know you all have a take on this, but I want, in part of that question of what's at stake for established residents, usually Black and brown residents that are being impacted by gentrification, what are the multiple ways in which we can think about these impacts? And I want to turn to you, Sabia, because you've worked so closely with so many long-term residents in Washington, D.C. What do they say is at stake for them as the once chocolate city has now become, as Derek says, the cappuccino city, and has lost its Black majority?
Sure. Well, these are really rich conversations, and I really feel privileged to have them with folks. And I think the bottom line is that, I mean, one frame is cultural loss. That's, you hear a lot of that. We've heard a lot of that since last summer, right? Cultural loss, erasure of Black culture, et cetera. And I think the bottom line is, if the people are vulnerable, then their culture is going to be vulnerable. And I want to frame this by saying that I think African Americans are in a unique sort of a position when we talk about this issue of culture, because our story has been so much a part of the American fabric for so many centuries. There's so many aspects of our culture, particularly our expressive culture, that are linked to American popular culture. Sometimes it's inextricably linked. So many aspects of the expressive culture attract so many people, and there's so many people that also exploit Black culture from outside. So, it's a very layered kind of a conversation. And I think it's also important to kind of bear in mind when folks start talking about culture, frequently, Black culture is very diverse, right? I mean, it's diverse. It extends in DC beyond jazz, beyond go-go, beyond the frames that people often put it in, hip hop, et cetera. It also extends beyond, those forms of the dormant and the dynamism and the innovation that we associate with Black urban life, that sort of style, et cetera. It's also in our foodways and in family structures and the way people communicate with each other and all that. And, a lot of that stuff is being threatened by gentrification, because if you're displacing the people, you're displacing the culture. And I realize that, displacement is something that's being debated, but certainly the people who've been displaced, I don't hear any debate from them. You know what I mean? This sort of, the working class people are particularly vulnerable when their kin networks become eradicated. And that's something that I have observed sitting around kitchen tables with people in the dining rooms, in the living rooms. People provide informal care and support for one another. Very, very viable, very, very tangible. And working class people and lower income people in particular rely on this. They rely on their neighbors for childcare. They rely on their neighbors to take them to the doctor, take them to the store, go to the pharmacy and pick up some medicines for me. And when you undermine those supports, you make people very vulnerable, economically vulnerable. They're vulnerable in terms of their health. And, there's a lot to this. And I can recall interviewing residents who talk with me about the loss of this establishment or the loss of this family member and how it increases costs for them because they've lost this kind of key resource. And it can really, lead to harm as well as alienation. And, this is my final point, I think, zooming out, if you think about African Americans suffering from a number of different health challenges disproportionately, lots of research showing that those things can be linked to stress, and the impacts of that, on vulnerable health, alienation, like trauma, like anxiety. These are all conditions that vulnerable communities in DC are living with. And they have very damaging cumulative effects, and they are related to the undermining of culture, and gentrification undermines culture.
Yeah. Derek, I want to turn to you on this question because you've thought very deeply about the multiple kinds of displacement that happens, but I would wonder if you could also layer on that to think about how COVID right now might be exacerbating some of those factors that lead to the kind of multiple displacements that we're talking about.
Of course, I want to jump right to the COVID situation because that's what we're dealing with right now, but I won't. I'll hold for a second. But I would just say, as Sabia mentioned, I mean, one of the things that's paramount is when people do get displaced, and they do, in the context of gentrification, it deteriorates their health. And I think that Mindy Foley-Love's got a great book from 2004 called Root Shock. And it's like, that's what, when people are ripped from their roots, and when plants are ripped from the root, they die. And she documents how the urban renewal history of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, but not just the past, the old urban renewal, the new urban renewal of the 1990s and the 2000s, taking down the public housing high-rises, sending people off with Section 8 vouchers to, who knows where they're going to go with limited help. It tears them from their networks. It tears them from their memories. And when that happens, there sometimes is a health deterioration, particularly for the elderly. So number one, when people get displaced, it affects their health. But I want to talk about another consequence, and it's the consequence of politics. That when you to get people elected, you need a mass voting district, right? You need people voting in a certain way. And when you gentrify a district by bringing in newcomers, they might vote differently. And when we think about the history of the US, we think about the Great Migrations and the movement of African Americans to communities that do become segregated. But when they're segregated, elected officials get, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Bill Dawson on the south side of Chicago. These are the first Black congressional representatives. And there's a Black political strength that is garnered in Harlem, in Washington, D.C., and on the south side of Chicago. And with this gentrification process, what you see is that political districts get diluted, and the stronghold that African Americans have had in urban centers start to dissipate. And Washington, D.C. is a perfect example of that. Washington, D.C., African Americans fought during the 70s and prior to that to get home rule, right? There was no elections for mayor and city council in Washington, D.C. for over 100 years. Shaw U Street becomes the place with Walter Fauntleroy and others, Marion Barry, that help get and pull back the power from the federal government so that DC gets home rule. Now, since home rule, all the mayors and the majority of elected city council members have been African American. But with the gentrification process that has swept through Washington, DC, it is flipped. We still have an African-American mayor, and we've always had African-American mayors, but the city council now is majority white. So this gentrification process is also related to Black political loss. And I think that's something that is very important. Now, I think I'll stop there because I want to give other panelists and everybody a chance to talk, but I think we'll get back to the COVID situation in a second. But let's go get another question.
Kevin, how would you compare this to what's happening in Harlem? And I'm not going to put the COVID question aside. I actually want to put it front and center in sort of thinking about issues of displacement that are happening right now. And maybe from the real estate perspective that you come with, thinking about how COVID is helping us to sort of rethink ideas about market. Because oftentimes, one of the things that we often hear in the gentrification is just the movement of capital and just the movement of people, as if these things happen naturally, as if there's something natural about the process of either the real estate market or gentrification, right? And so when you're in talking about COVID and its impact, does this help us to expose some of the ways in which some of these processes really are manufactured and how our markets are somewhat manufactured as well?
It may slow gentrification down, but the underpinnings of inequality are still there. And so it's not going to disrupt that. And I think, so in the 1990s, when I was working at Abyssinian Development Corporation, I know it's hard for people to believe now, but we never would have believed that what has happened now was going to happen. We felt that we were working for an improvement. And we used to even say we wanted to link Harlem, the market of Harlem, with lower Manhattan. Because when you looked at Manhattan maps at that time, for tourists, they stopped at 110th Street or at 96th Street often. Harlem wasn't even in there. And what we didn't see is, Willow, your question in that, and what the linking meant was making Harlem safe for white people. To be blunt, that wasn't the goal of us. But when you do begin having improvements, you get better city services, that is what makes those neighborhoods comfortable. But once you do, because the people who are already there have so little capital, they can't hold back the tidal wave of capital that's now coming in and for decades was going around Harlem, literally. That when you used to go uptown in a cab, when you got to 96th Street, you see all the cabs turning. That is what was happening with money too. And so COVID may provide a breather, but it's not going to change that. I mean, when I look at, so I graduated from college in 1979 and began working for the City of Cleveland Department of Community Development. So when I look over the years at what we've done in terms of neighborhood improvement on the nonprofit side, we've done a decent job of developing real estate. But what Sadia was talking about is the people. And Abyssinian Development Corporation had social services, but you need to have a very robust social service support, job creation, community investment for the people who are already there. When the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone was created in the 90s, I was part of some of the community committees. They were very intentional about not creating ownership in businesses or using their money for people to buy things. It was creating jobs, and jobs were needed, but the people making the real money were the people who got the ownership as a result of that. And so that was an opportunity to link federal money with the people who are already there. And it was missed. And so the opportunity zones that are being talked about now is the same thing. It's outside capital. It's not linked to the people who are there. And you'll get renovated buildings, but you'll get displacement. It'll be the cycle again. And so that's, I believe, what needs to happen is that we need to understand when we talk about community, it's really those people who are there. And I think people are reluctant to help poor, working class people in Black and Latino neighborhoods. There's almost this kind of, oh, well, let the market take care of them. And we know, and they know it won't do that.
Anybody else want to jump in on this COVID piece?
I'm ready to jump back in, but Sabia, you want to come
well,
on in?
I guess I'll just say one thing, because I guess a lot of this stuff is completely up in the air, so we're kind of waiting to see what's going on. I do recall a article in the Washington Post which said that New Yorkers are coming to DC. You know, DC is a less densely populated city, and I think that perhaps it would make it an attractive destination for folks who can live anywhere they want and can carry on with their work because of class privilege. So, you know, there's that piece. I understand that billionaires are having a ball right now. Their fortunes are just bouncing off the walls. And so I would assume they have a number of different choices as to what they want to do with their money. Meanwhile, regular folks are vulnerable. You know, I mean, we're waiting to see the impacts of evictions. the impacts of the slowdowns, the impacts of the shrinking work. I mean, there's a lot going on, and these are fluctuating indicators because, you have the legislation that's, here or there, depending on what side of the bed a certain person wakes up on. So, we're really waiting to see, I think, what the huge impacts are going to be. But, it's just really clear that things aren't looking good for regular folks. So that vulnerability is going to be reproduced. And, and then it's going to have an impact, one would imagine, on the housing market.
Yeah, Derek, and answering this question, I also wonder if you can talk not only about COVID, but also how the Black Lives Matter movement and the anti-racist uprisings that we've seen is helping us to really understand the deep connections between, say, policing and gentrification, but also the potential of organizing around anti-displacement at this moment.
And great question. I thought I would just have to try to do the COVID question, but they're all interrelated, right? They're all happening at the same time. But let's just take a pause and think about the Great Recession. We are in a recession that is close to the Depression, but we just had one that was close to the Depression. It was called the Great Recession. Wasn't that long ago, 2007 to 2009. And what happened during that period? Yes, gentrification slowed and paused for a moment because capital markets froze. Developers couldn't quite get their loans. They weren't quite sure what was going to happen. Banks were a little hesitant. But just as we started to recover in 2009, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, San Francisco, Portland, Austin, I mean, you name the city, the gentrification took off at an incredible rate. And the economic recovery that we had coming out of the Great Recession was disproportionate. Not everybody recovered. Not all markets recovered. But you had a set of investors that could get in and take advantage of certain places, and gentrification went wild all over the country and disproportionately happened in low-income minority neighborhoods. So now let's fast forward to our current time period. People are like, oh, we're in a pandemic, we're in another recession. Maybe gentrification is going to die. Maybe people aren't going to want to come to the city center anymore. But what is happening now? Sabia just mentioned the stock market. I mean, it bounces around, but as a whole is still doing great. So investors have a lot of money that they're putting in real estate investment trusts that are going to buy low and then try to redevelop and sell high. So they are already going into markets, and it's not just domestic capital, it's international capital. So it's elites from around the world that are trying to profit. Also, not even just elites, anybody who can get a mortgage right now. You can get a mortgage for 15 years at 2.1%. You can get a 30-year fix at 2.6%. These are the lowest lending rates, interest-wise, in US history. So if you have capital already as collateral, you can get a really cheap money and loan, and you can go and buy an investment property. So if New York is going down a little bit because some people bounced out to the suburbs, if Washington, D.C.'s market has stabilized and gone down a little bit, capital is waiting to swoop in, buy it, hold it, wait for the pandemic to end, and then you will have a resurgence of people coming back to the city, and the market value rates for these properties will go up, and people will sell and make a big profit. And so what I'm predicting is that in a year or two, maybe 3, we will have another wave of gentrification that may even dwarf the rates that we saw from 2010 to 2019. So I think it's pretty scary right now. Yeah, there is a moratorium on evictions, but that's going to end. And when that ends, people are going to be forced out. And then investors are going to swoop in and buy properties, hold them, upgrade them, and gentrify neighborhoods. So, I think for investors, actually the projections are, it's looking pretty good. For low-income people who are frontline workers, who are unemployed, and are barely holding on with the government checks that have, or the check that has gone out, and with the moratorium on the evictions, they're in trouble. And we need to help them. We need government intervention from the federal level, from the state level, and from the city level to help the people that are about to be displaced with the evictions. And also who, if they don't get evicted, might be displaced because they can't afford the rents that are going to rise in a 2 to 3 year period. All right, so that's my answer on the COVID stuff. Now, and I didn't even mention that, COVID is disproportionately affecting communities of color, right? So who's getting the disease more? Who is dying disproportionately? It is people of color. Who it does not have access to medical care and the loans that I just talked about, disproportionately people of color. So I think that this COVID pandemic economic crisis is going to exacerbate the racial inequalities that we have in our country. And that's regardless of who is in the presidency. The uprisings. So I think the uprisings were necessary. One, because of the mounting police brutality, which, I don't even know if it's increased. I think the visibility has increased, but I don't know necessarily if the police brutality has increased. But definitely more people know it, are aware of it, and don't want to stand for it anymore, and are willing to put their life on the line to protest, to try to change the way that policing happens. But we just talked about beyond policing, there's a whole other set of economic violence that is occurring. We just covered it in this panel, from blockbusting to redlining to the placement of public housing, to just the gentrification process that disproportionately affects people of color and displaces them and puts their health at risk. So what we are seeing, and it's interesting, in Washington, D.C., and I know we have a lot of people that are in the Washington, D.C. area on this panel, take a look at Southwest D.C. action. They protested police brutality, but they also are protesting the gentrification process. They are also protesting the way in which the Washington, D.C. gives tax breaks to developers to redevelop the Southwest area. That area in the 1950s went through an urban renewal that displaced thousands and thousands of African Americans. Now, billions of dollars are going into the waterfront. That went into the baseball stadium. It's going into Navy Yard. And a lot of that capital was kind of induced to come there by seed money that was underwriting these developments from the Washington, D.C. government. And so there are people who are low income, who are in public housing, that are in Southwest and Southeast, who are being displaced, who are threatened with displacement because of the influx of this capital. So you do see groups around the country not only protesting the police brutality, but also the brutality of the economic violence that is affecting their communities and leading to their displacement. So, I think we have to go beyond police brutality. We have to address it, but we have to go and do things such as land bank, provide affordable housing. We've got to bolster our Section 8 program to keep people in place. We've got to rehab about $70 billion worth of public housing just to get it up to code. And so there's a lot of money that has gone out, and where it's gone out to small businesses. But we have not put money out during this recession to undergird our housing infrastructure. And we need to do that. And I hope that we do that. But in order to do that, I'm going to be very blunt. We've got to change the presidency. But even if we change the presidency, I don't know if we have the political wherewithal in our country to move all of Congress. But it takes the president and it takes Congress. And we have got to start deploying not just billions, but trillions of dollars to change the racial landscape of our country.
Thank you, Derek. We have heard—
Now I'm going to take a sip of beer too on that one.
I'll join you. We have heard a lot in the chat about different kinds of policies that might be useful in helping to counter some of the trends that we're seeing. We have the suggestion of universal basic income, which I think would probably be on our wish list of things for a new occupant of the White House. we had suggestions, we had a question about the lack of diversity that we're seeing in the housing stock, particularly in DC, right? With the amount of micro units, with the amount of units that are not being built for families, but are being built for singles. And we also had a question about Black-owned banks and the role that they might be able to play in helping to boost capital and wealth, specifically for the African-American community. So Kevin, I'm gonna turn to you and just ask what you see as some of the possibilities, either that have been mentioned in the chat or others that you might sort of think about through your lens of looking at what's happening in Harlem, and what are some of the fruitful paths that you're seeing?
I live in Yellow Springs, Ohio, where Antioch College is, and I'm on the board of Yellow Springs Home Inc., which is a nonprofit community development corporation. And we operate under the land trust model so that the buildings that we develop or that we build all become part of a community land trust. And the people who buy or rent those properties, they sign leases. If they're renting, they buy the house, but they lease the land. The land belongs to the land trust. And when the homeowners sell, they sell it back. The land trust manages that sale, and there's a cap on their appreciation, what they can get. And so the sale is structured in a way so that it's still affordable to people whose incomes typically are between 60 to 80% of median. And so the idea is long-term affordability. And when we look at, if I look at my experience in New York with Abyssinian in the 90s, we developed a lot of housing through the low-income housing tax credit program. Those programs have a requirement that the units stayed affordable for people 60% of median or less for 15 years. In the 90s, that sounded like a long time, but 15 years, the first development we did was in 1992. Harlem was a very different place in 2007. And a lot of those properties are no longer affordable because nonprofits felt the pressure just like everybody else, and they sold them. And so some of it is working with nonprofit and nonprofit boards to, like, it was within their right to do that. But if they do that, then there's nothing to be a barrier against that onslaught of the market. And it was assumed that because these were nonprofits, they would stay affordable, but that wasn't built in. And so that's what the land trust allows. In terms of banking, Carver Federal Savings Bank in Harlem was created in the 40s for that purpose. And it's played a role in Harlem and Brooklyn. But Black banks have a hard time competing too because they are relatively small. There's a lot of regulations that come with that. And so in a way, they can't take the risks that the bigger banks can take. And so they would need some capital infusion probably to allow them to play those roles. And